The majority of politicians are men, and there's continual reference to the boys' club. Why is this such a hostile environment for women to enter? And how can we support and level out the playing field?
And so, just to be clear, you submitted that last week before any of us knew about this Four Corners. You have just watched it. What did you make of it?
I found it really concerning how much focus there was on, I guess, politicians engaging in affairs and that leaving them open to compromise. And it felt like there was a bit of lacking concern around the support for the women in these staffing roles and the compromise they were being left open to and the possible advantage they were being taken of and the pressure with that power imbalance.
OK, Fran, I want to turn to you first up. You've just seen that program as well. Your reaction?
I have. Oh, my reaction is keep it in your bloody pants, mate. That's my reaction. Yeah, keep it in your pants. I want to come back to your point about the issue of compromise, because I think there was a note for me in that broadcast where, you know, you were talking about, Malcolm, about the compromise that perhaps Christian Porter and Alan Tudge might have put themselves in and that it's not a good look for them. I think the bigger question here is around the women. And exactly as you said, Josie, and I'm so glad that you asked that question, well, where do they go if they feel like they need support? Is silence complicity in a situation like this? One of the other telling things for me in that broadcast, right, was this really small detail. And I'm going to place a bet that you sort of feel very similarly, but the WhatsApp group. The WhatsApp group that the Liberal women had and that they were sharing stories in. This is not new. This has been happening since the dawn of time, and I can guarantee you that every friendship group, women in various professions, every family WhatsApp group, they have got a thread about men that are creepers, men that are horny, men that are abusive, men that you need to stay away from. It is a warning call that women have had for so long, and now everybody is hearing about it.
These were consensual relationships, though, that were reported tonight. Why is this in the public interest to know about it?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think in the case of Christian Porter, he's billing himself as somebody who is a family man. Alan Tudge is the same, voted no on the same-sex marriage plebiscite on the basis that a family unit is very important and you must have family values. I don't care who you're stupping at the end of the day, right? And there are relationships that form in workplaces and they go on to become very fruitful relationships. What I care about, though, is the hypocrisy. If you are out here espousing family values and you are having an affair, then you are a hypocrite and you don't get to talk about values, as I know Alan Tudge loves to talk about.
Malcolm Turnbull, you pulled Christian Porter into your office for a meeting on the 6th of December 2017. You talked to him about this, you say he acknowledged it. Why did you then promote him on the 20th of December?
Well, look, just to be clear, Porter came to see me to talk about something else, and I had heard these reports of him being out drinking and being drunk in the company of young female staffers. I was not aware of any suggestions that it was anything more than that, and I gave him the very sensible advice that I did, and he, you know, he didn't argue with me. He didn't say I wasn't there, it wasn't me or anything like that. He acknowledged that, and you know, I assumed that he wouldn't do it again.
But
I mean, you know, I wasn't.
But to be fair, on Four Corners, you said the reason you had to have this conversation was because he might be compromised. That Canberra was a city of spies, not all of them are on our side. Doing this sort of thing might compromise him.
Well, potentially, yes, potentially it could. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it was my, you know, look, I'm not, I wasn't trying to be censorious about it. It is, you have a lot of personal conversations as Prime Minister. I mean, you're kind of like, in some respects, you know, generally your office deal with a lot of these issues, but sometimes there are conversations that only the PM can have, and that was one of them. And basically, my advice to him was, it must, you know, this sort of thing must never happen again. Now, there's a lot of stuff about Christian Porter in that program that I did not know at the time, and frankly, I didn't know until tonight. So it is, you know, but from my point of view, ministers should behave themselves, you know, decorously when they're in public. And I mean, you know, Jan makes a point about people, being able to have their private lives as they wish, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. The only point I made was that they should not have sexual relations with their staff. That has been, out of order in the private sector for, as I said on the program, I would say for at least 20, probably 25 years, if not longer.
Can I just make a quick point on that? Because, you had been aware of some of the allegations about Christian Porter and some of the stuff that he might have been involved with.
Well, that's actually not right. I mean, I don't want to sound, I don't want to sound like I wasn't paying attention, but when you're Prime Minister of Australia, you are very focused on running the country, right?
But the question around why you promoted him, I think, speaks to a bigger issue around the culture, right?
You think I was too forgiving?
I think you were too forgiving, and I think this is the problem that, I do.
I've had a reputation for being too forgiving.
Well, I mean, that's a diplomatic way of putting it, though, as well, because I think what a lot of women really care about and really, know is happening is that it's not just the men that might behave inappropriately, but it's all of the padding around them that allows them to be elevated further and further up the power chain. And I think everybody's got to look at themselves and ask, OK, well, how am I enabling that? How am I supporting that? What am I doing in this instance, even though you're not the person that might have...
Jan, I think that's fair criticism. I think that is fair criticism. At the time, I was aware of there having been an incident that had, got a bit of notoriety. I had the impression that, he was drinking too much, again, that he wouldn't be Robinson Crusoe in Canberra in that regard. And so I gave him some fatherly or avuncular advice, which he accepted, didn't argue with me. But you may be right. Maybe I was too forgiving.
I think we just need to be specific about this. Was it a mistake to appoint him to a position where he had oversight of the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, and that he would sit on the National Security Committee?
Well, look, I don't think so. Obviously didn't think so at the time. I treated it as though it was a misjudgment, an error. He'd done the wrong thing. He'd been injudicious, whatever you want to call it. But there's a lot of stuff in the program tonight about patterns of conduct that I wasn't aware of. So it is, that you really. I mean, Jan's making a point that I, may well have been too forgiving. I think certainly if I'd known at the time...
I think the point is that
if I'd known at the time what was broadcast tonight, I would have made further inquiries before I made him Attorney General. I think
Carr,
that's true.
The truth is this is not unique to one side of politics, this sort of culture, is it?
Well, let's look at a couple of underlying principles here, beyond the two cases of ministers taken apart on the program. I think the first principle is one that's got to be absolutely adhered to and insisted on, and I'd be extremely disappointed if it weren't being adhered to in Canberra or in any other parliament, and that is that women should not feel harassed or oppressed to deliver sexually for male bosses. That's the key principle.
Yep.
And there's too much of that in the past in Australian workplace cultures, and I think it's fair to say the Four Corners program didn't say that was the case with these two affairs where women spoke out, but I would like to think that we have moved beyond that in the workplace culture in a Parliament House. That's the first principle. And we ought to make sure that our anti-discrimination laws see that women, including young, vulnerable women, especially maybe in their first job in a minister's office, never feel they can be harassed by a sort of Roger Ailes figure, if you think of the loudest voice, that great encapsulation of how awful and oppressive these bosses have been in the past. So I think that's the first principle.
Jenny Hocking, Canberra, as you know from your work as an historian, has always been a city of secrets, hasn't it?
Oh, it has, and for a long time these sorts of things, there was a tacit agreement that they just weren't revealed publicly and by the media or by other politicians. It's a very good thing that's changed. What concerns me about the things that were being revealed in the program today, and it was a pretty devastating portrait, is that we're looking fundamentally at a real power imbalance within the workplace. And I think that's the essence of the difficulty here, is that women, particularly younger women, as Bob said, perhaps going into their first job, are not in the same position in terms of power if it is a boss, in fact, seeking to have that relationship, even if it is consensual. So there are some real issues there, I think, that suggest this is perhaps endemic, something that perhaps needs to be addressed far more strongly than it is. And I congratulate Malcolm Turnbull for introducing what was called the bonk ban, because I think it at least is strengthening the recognition that that sort of power imbalance in the workplace does cause great difficulties. And it was striking in one of those stories that, of course, it was the woman involved who left her job. And as she said, she left a job that she loved, that she had been in for several years. And that is typically the pattern, that it is the women who suffer out of that relationship once it ends. It's the women who lose their jobs. And yet things go on, as we've seen with Christian Porter and others.
But on the bonk ban,
Jenny's absolutely right, Hamish. That is, and I just want to strongly reinforce that. And I think I made that point at the time I introduced the bonk ban, that the terrible name, we're stuck with it. But the reality is, what happens in relationships like this, it is always the junior person, who is very often a woman, who is then either loses her job or gets moved somewhere else. You know, and that's why it just shouldn't happen. You know, not in 2017.
With respect, Malcolm, didn't you oversee the continuation of that culture by promoting Christian Porter?
Well, no. I mean, Porter. Look, we've just got to be very clear about this. I mean, what I was advised of was that Porter had been out drinking too much in the company of young female staffers. That was literally all I knew. There's much more, a lot of detail in the program tonight I was not aware of. That was literally all I was aware of. And I took the opportunity of just reminding him that that was unacceptable, and that he basically had to turn it up and behave himself. And that was but I wasn't aware of any suggestion that he was having an affair with somebody who worked for him, or I'm not even sure whether that was alleged in the program. So, but certainly my information was related to, drinking too much in the company of young female staffers. I mean, look, I've got a very good recollection of the discussion, because as an old lawyer, I sat down as soon as it was over and I wrote a very detailed account of the meeting.
Paul Kelly, is Christian Porter the right person to be pushing through a National Integrity Commission for Australia?
Well, what we saw tonight was a total caricature of Christian Porter. And what this program does, it raises a lot of fundamental questions. There are a lot of issues here. The culture of the parliament, which is still dominated by male concepts, male power. That's got to be addressed a lot more. The problems of the Liberal Party, the toxic culture of the Liberal Party. But we've also got to address the media. What the ABC has done tonight is that it's crashed through some media barriers and created new media barriers. So, how far do we go in terms of our definition of the public interest? That program was about 2 senior ministers, and it was essentially, in the case of one of them, about an affair he'd had. Now, politicians have affairs, ministers have affairs. I've known prime ministers who've had affairs. So we've got to ask ourselves how far we go in terms of the definition of public interest. And we should have a debate about this. I understand the logic in the program. I understand that. But I think there are doubts about how far this program went. And in the case of Christian Porter, this is someone who served with distinction in the West Australian Parliament and in the National Parliament, and he's trashed tonight as someone who's nothing much more than as a young man who vomited in a bag, kissed girls, and was a committed sexist. So we need to be very careful about the damage we do to people's reputation here and ask ourselves, is that an accurate portrait or was it a caricature? That's a really important question
So
to
are you
ask.
saying this stuff was not in the public interest? Is that your claim?
Well, what I'm saying, Hamish, is we have to have a debate about how far the public interest goes, because that program has redefined what's in the public interest.
In
Now,
what way, though?
well, as I just said, I mean, I understand the argument here in terms of the treatment of women.
But Paul, your employers, the News Corp, thought it was in the public interest to take a picture of Barnaby Joyce's former staffer, Vicky Campion, as she was walking across the road pregnant with his child, put it on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. So that was obviously, you'd say that was in the public interest?
Well, what I would say, Malcolm, is just make the obvious point that the Barnaby Joyce situation is a different situation to the Christian Porter situation. OK?
Oh, yeah.
Now,
I'm
not
just saying. Yeah, OK, but the bottom line is, it was I mean, Barnaby is still very aggrieved by that. Vicky Campion is very aggrieved by that. You know, she was sort of, obviously she was, you know, caught unawares by a photographer, probably, you know, not feeling she was looking her best. It was a, you know, there it is. But I think the journalist got an award for it.
Of course, but Malcolm...
You say of course, which just means that everything you've just said is contradicted by your endorsement of that photograph.
That's not the case at all, Malcolm.
Well, I think it is.
Well, that is not the case at all. As I said, they are different situations. But what I'm saying is, I understand there's a degree of public interest in what this program's revealed about the two cabinet ministers. I understand that completely. But all I'm saying is we've got to ask ourselves how far this goes. Malcolm Turnbull, as Prime Minister, promoted Christian Porter. So how serious was all that material we saw earlier on in the program? Malcolm Turnbull decided that it was not serious enough not to promote Porter and make him Attorney General. So Malcolm's got serious questions to answer here as well.
Okay. Sure, yeah.
We need
I
to
think
move
I've
on,
answered
but I just do need to correct something Fran said. I think Alan Tudge actually voted yes to same-sex marriage.
Oh,
just check that while we're
Thank you, fact checkers.
Remember, you can stream us live on iView. Join the conversation on all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag. Please do keep it.
Yeah, one qualification, Hamish, in this. Did we have to hear about what Porter did in his wild youth? Why was that relevant to his performance now? He's the last person in the world I'd defend. He's probably a climate change denier, along with everything else. But
with respect, his behaviour
as a wild youth was no different from that of George W. Bush's. He was a real reprobate, a drunk, a drug taker, and a drunken driver when he was his age. He turned out to be an appalling president, but he's got enough to be. He's got to be enough.
If I ever get charged with something, remind me not to hire you to defend me.
He's got to be enough to be judged on, without invoking his youth.
And I think
I just wonder. Now, I'm making a very serious point. How relevant was that, and which one of us wants to be judged on how we performed in our late teens or 20s? The other qualification here is this. The other qualification here is this. It's very hard to codify these things. Bonking ban is fine, it was popular. And women have got to be protected in the workforce.
Yes.
From the depredations of males who think they're there for their pleasure.
But we're always thinking about the protection of women. Protection from who?
There is
protection from
that's a valid point, but there's a whole world of relationships out there, and all of us can think of examples of serious, respectful relationships that began in workplaces.